BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Today we're going to be talking all about John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor for Donald Trump, former UN Ambassador for George W. Bush, and somebody that's been in the news a lot lately. A lot of people are anticipating the book that's going to be coming out from John Bolton, his big $2 million book deal, not to mention that he's tied to some things involving the impeachment trial and the proceedings that have been going on in the House and the Senate and all that. But to focus more on just John Bolton as a person, one of the things I thought we would do is pull up some of the quotes and sayings that have been plastered all over the internet and have a little bit of just a free-for-all discussion about John Bolton. I mentioned from time to time that sometimes I like to listen to his speeches online because it's not only about listening to what John Bolton has to say, but also looking at the public perception of him, and the things that people are saying in the comments section is often quite different than what people are kind of saying about him in day-to-day life. In short, John Bolton is somewhat of well, he's definitely a Washington insider, but he wasn't always that way. He was somebody who kind of worked his way up into the ranks of Washington, for lack of a better term, definitely starting out as someone who was outside of that whole Washington social elite circle, and then always having this type of detestment for it, and just like having some contempt for the Washington social elites. And that's really the assessment of Keith Suter, who hosts the show called Global Truth, which I'm a big fan of. But here's a big quote from John Bolton when he simply says, "I am not a neoconservative." That's a direct quote from John Bolton right here. What do we make of that? Well, there's that expression in English, right? If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, flies like a duck, floats like a duck, it's most likely a duck. Is John Bolton a neoconservative? Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. I mean, the thing is, though, neoconservative means some different things to different people, but when people are talking about neocons on the television, they most likely mean the modern day form of imperialism that promotes that if you want to preserve democracy, you have to go to war. And I would say that that's the entire public perception of John Bolton in the MSM. That's just all they show about him, is that he's the guy that wants to preserve democracy by going to war. He is a neocon. And John Bolton doesn't seem to shy away from too many of those things. Yeah, he'll get a little fluffy with the language, but it really doesn't seem like he is shying away from those things, because it's like he's all about advancing U.S. interests, because if someone else had the power, if someone else had the ability to have more power than the United States of America, the political situation would be far worse. And sometimes when you think about it, I get those weird ideas and I'm like, what if that's actually right? But at the same time, one of the things though, well, let's just read our next quote, because that's tied into that. Quote from John Bolton: "Diplomacy is not an end in itself if it does not advance U.S. interests." Because what do we talk about on this channel? More about the concept of how large-level political issues are not solved with warfare. They are solved with diplomacy. But what John Bolton's saying is, if it's not going to advance the U.S. interests, then it's wrong, more or less. And I completely can comprehend that a nation does not have friends. A nation only has interests. A nation doesn't even have true allies. A nation has interests. So, I mean, it's just that whole concept of you have to be in it for yourself, and you also have to be in it for your country. Your country has to be in it for yourself. That I can comprehend, but warfare, you really just got to think that a lot of these warfare tactics that are used by neocons could most likely be avoided, and not only there must be a better way to go about this thing, just in the scheme of possibilities, there is a way to solve conflicts with a reduction of violent deaths. We just have to find it, not this whole concept of preemptive strikes to prevent world war. What was that thing? What was that line from Otto von Bismarck, that's like committing suicide out of fear of death? A preemptive strike to prevent a major war is like committing suicide out of fear of death. Or, I mean, the thing that is plastered around on the internet in the meme politics world is more like it's like military conflict to end war. I got to get that a little bit better. A preemptive strike to avoid a war is like fucking for virginity, or war for peace is like fucking for virginity. I think we finally got it there. Okay, we made it in the long run. It just took a little bit of a process there. Excuse me. Here's another one from John Bolton. Individual liberty is the whole purpose of political life, and I thought it was threatened then, and I think that it is threatened now. In terms of the ideology that John Bolton claims that he is all about, he says very clearly in the scheme of quotes that he is a libertarian conservative. He does not want to be called a neocon, but it seems like he is definitely not being any sort of libertarian conservative in terms of foreign policy, which is what he's all about. I mean, John Bolton wasn't not in the Trump administration because of his charming personality or his stance on social issues. He was definitely in there because of foreign policy issues. But I don't know how he could talk about small government and being a libertarian conservative if he's going to have the type of interventionist foreign policy that he advocates. Okay, though. I mean, I've also been horribly critical of Mike Pompeo for saying that, for saying many partisan talking points when he during his role of Secretary of State, because it's like once you get to these level of diplomatic interactions, partisanship should go out the window. It should have really no place in this. It's not only about being a partisan hack when you're the Secretary of State or you're the National Security Advisor. And once again, you can look at this just from the standpoint of someone who is trying to solve conflicts with a reduction of violent death in the world, not spreading war because it increases the power of the United States. The only way to preserve democracy is to go to war. Absolutely not. But in terms of the labels about being a neoconservative and such, there are a lot of brands of neoconservatism out there. I mean, not everybody is in line with Leo Strauss and Irving Kristol, and because Douglas Murray tried to revamp neoconservatism in the United Kingdom, he wrote a book about it, simply titled Neoconservatism, and he sounds quite different when he's talking to Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, but Douglas Murray sounds like a very different person when he's talking about the cleansing of Europe. And if you ever get to listen to some things from Irving Kristol, who wrote the American book on neoconservatism, the autobiography of an idea, he is a horrendous public speaker. I don't mean any disrespect to Irving Kristol, Requiescent in Pace, but it's like, it's just, I could never follow him for a second when he was talking, just rambling, rambling, rambling. But yes, he is one of the major sources of neoconservatism in the United States, and we can always go back to Leo Strauss. When it comes to John Bolton, I mean, it really just depends on how you want to label somebody. What I think is more important is John Bolton is the guy that people look to when they say, this guy wants to go to war. This guy wants to preserve U.S. interests by going to war. And the only way to do that is to fight off any person who has a chance to have more power in the world. And our next one here is I believe in individual government and maximum individual freedom. And, like, I don't think anyone's going to take too much of an exception with that. I mean, the reason why we have government is to improve individual freedom. Even Franklin Delano Roosevelt talked about how a government should be able to allow someone's individual opportunities and capabilities to be as great as they possibly can. And I'm paraphrasing with that one. Did a little bit better than that one than the peace and fucking for virginity thing, but I mean that's a lot of people are just saying that's why we have a government. It's a structure that is in society that allows individuals to reach their maximum potential, more or less. And even Ayn Rand might be somewhat on par with that, except she would be for the absolute smallest amount of government possible. I don't really reject the Ayn Randian thinking the smallest minority is a minority of one. We want to talk about the rights of the individual. And here's one quote from John Bolton, though. Our biggest national security crisis is Barack Obama, and this was said a couple years ago. And that's not the craziest thing in the world to say, because it's just like Barack Obama was heavily involved in interventionist foreign policy. Barack Obama was heavily involved in just bombing campaigns all across the Middle East. If you look at the situation in Libya, and Libya played a very large role in the refugee crisis. Syria played a large role in the refugee crisis, which is affecting countless European nations. I mean, Barack Obama was someone who really was involved with instability in terms of foreign policy, a very unstable foreign policy that came out of the Obama administration, and a lot of people really turned a blind eye to it. And a lot of the Democrats that I was talking to at the time were they were so disappointed in Obama, even for the bombing campaigns that he called for in Afghanistan. Not to mention, though, but like they have to be aware of, Barack Obama talked about this prior to 2008, prior to the election. Obama was very clear that he wanted to increase military involvement in Afghanistan. And on the eve of the election, I was just having a conversation with someone who said that one of the reasons why she was not voting for Obama and she was voting for John McCain back in 2008 was because she was just like, Obama's not going to change anything with foreign policy. He's just going to move troops from Iraq to Afghanistan. And what did Barack Obama do? He moved troops from Iraq to Afghanistan. In 2011, there's a big withdrawal of troops that came home for a little bit to the United States of America, and then they were redeployed to Afghanistan. It's like Obama was very involved with interventionist foreign policy and continuing military conflict. But what we can say, though, is to talk a little bit more about John Bolton. There is no doubt that Iran funds and supplies Hamas with weapons. So that's a quote from John Bolton. There's no doubt that Iran funds and supplies Hamas with weapons. What do we say about that one there? I think, though, that it's always good to be aware of these types of perspectives and to look at the alliances about what's going on in the Middle East and who is partnered with whom. Because, I mean, a lot of these things come out. We have Julian Assange and John Pilger trying to tell us that the governments of Saudi Arabia and Qatar are giving money to ISIS, and now you have Hamas is being supported by Iran, and we have all seen the stuff on the nightly news about how the main reason why we have conflicts going on in the Middle East is because the Saudis and the Iranians are not playing ball together. They are against each other. And you can really see, though, that the economically weaker nations are bearing the full frontal of the violence. If you look at the conflict in Yemen, is heavily tied to the Iranians and the Saudis. Not to mention Somalia. We brought up multiple possibilities about how the Qataris could be behind a lot of the violence that's going on in Somalia so that they will have access to ports in the Horn of Africa. I mean, there are lots of unentangled alliances that happen in the Middle East, and it's done for strategic purposes and it's done for the expansion of military powers. There are a lot of these things that are going on in the world. So we can gather from just looking at the information that's available online. Now, here's an interesting quote from John Bolton. There's no such thing as the United Nations. If the UN Secretary building in New York had lost 10 stories, it wouldn't make a bit of difference. What do we make of that one? I was talking to somebody about the United Nations once, and it was like, do you think that the United Nations is a good thing or a bad thing? Because a lot of people are heavily critical of things like NATO. They're like, NATO's a relic of the Cold War. We don't need NATO anymore. But like, I just asked that question though. What do you think about the United Nations? Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? And his response was simple. The UN can be viewed as a tool chest. It has like a bunch of things in it. Someone could pick up a hammer and use that for a destructive purpose, or they could pick up the hammer and use that for a constructive purpose to build something. It could be a weapon or it could be a constructive tool. And that's how you can view the United Nations. And I always think about that. But at the same time, though, that whole thing that we talk about for the Juvenalian quote, who is there to guard the guards themselves? Is there any possibility that the United Nations could be something that's going to blow out of control? There's going to be certain elements of the United Nations that are going to be unchecked, and they aren't going to have the same amount of power for everyone. Well, they definitely don't have the same power for everyone. That's why they have the Security Council, right? So it's like, I mean, something like that could be heavily exploited. And John Bolton's almost like they're on the UN Security Council. There should be only one nation, and that should be the United States of America, and pretty much anyone else is untrustworthy. That was another quote that came up here in some way. So, I mean, what it sounds like with John Bolton is that he does seem to talk a lot about libertarian conservatism, but at the same time, that doesn't reach all corners of the political world. I mean, I just really don't believe that that's kind of something that is reaching absolutely everything that he has been talking about. So we also have to be aware that he is somebody who is very much pro gay marriage, and he's also pro, well, not very open to things on social issues. And he was saying that there were things about there's no reason why gay men or gay women cannot serve in the military. I think people are pretty much kind of come to a consensus about that one. And when it comes to the concept of transgender individuals serving in the military, there was a transgender military ban that was instituted by Donald Trump, and I think that was a bit misreported in the media because it really has nothing to do with someone's social stance on transgender people. It was more about how people who are transgender have to take hormones regularly, right? And they can't guarantee that that hormones are gonna be available in the field or just overseas after deployment. And it's the same thing with type 1 diabetics and organ donor recipients, people who regularly have to take life-threatening medication like that. Or, if I mean, by life-threatening, I mean their body will be greatly altered or they will be at some sort of health risk if they don't get their medication or hormones in the case of a transgender individual. And then the kind of situation got blown out of control talking about that issue. But what I can say about this one is it seems like John Bolton is very open on the social issues, and you find that a lot of people are actually kind of going down this libertarian conservative pathway. I mean, Roger Stone has said some very similar things on the social issues as John Bolton, but in short, people from Washington really care about power. It's about power at the end of the day. And I mean, this is a very strong criticism of the United Nations. And in reality, I mean, we can definitely see, though, the United States is not the worst nation in the world. The United States is a very good nation in the world in terms of actions. And when you look at the actions of a nation like China or a nation like Russia, very powerful countries, but at the same time, many more human rights abuses. And I mean, when John Bolton says that there should be only one nation on the Security Council of the United States of America, I don't know. I want to mull that over a little bit. Not it completely. I mean, I would need a little bit more convincing than that. What I can definitely say is some of the nations that have a lot of power in the world are horrendous, and they do run very corrupt criminal style regimes. So, I mean, we can always be aware of that, and it's very important to pay attention to the entanglement of political alliances, particularly in what's going on with the Middle East, because a lot of that carries on to what's going on in the Horn of Africa and these surrounding areas. And we'll definitely mention some things about Central Asia if we're going to talk about the situation in the Middle East. In 2017, one of the things that I kind of came to the conclusion of was everything in life is interlocking. I mean, you look at the political situation, one of those countries we were talking about, Yemen or something like that. You say the political situation in Yemen, that is going to be connected to an entire host of other issues. Everything is interlocking. It's like just a brick in an endless wall. It's just going to be going step by step, and it's going to be affecting a different series of events. Does that mean that we have to talk about going to war so frequently? I sure hope not. Can diplomacy solve these conflicts? Well, yes, it can, for the sole fact that it's about problem solving and it's about finding the solution. The solution exists. It's just that it's rather difficult to find sometimes. And that's why this Henry Kissinger realism, realpolitik, never sat well with me, and it never sat well with a lot of people. The whole concept of 10,000 people have to die today so that many more don't die over the next year or the next 2 years. It's like, it's also people are making decisions because they don't want to lose their own power, and they also are making decisions because they simply don't have the answer yet, so it leads to catastrophe and it leads to destruction. So, well, the real answer is let's just have fewer wars in the first place, and I don't think that's any statement that's meant to be disregarded. All right, well, what do you think about John Bolton? What do you think about the kind of presence of the United States foreign policy? What do you think about anything that we have said in this upload here? Excuse the little jumbling and the mumbling in the middle bit, in the middle part there. But that's all for me now. Please drop a comment below. Until next time.